AXES, the easy noob weapon to use, way easier to use than a sword. Well, yeah, that's the internet wisdom. Is it actually true? Not really, but maybe in a way it is right. Let's consider the gravity of the question. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, over the years, I have been irked many times, I've mentioned this in previous videos, that there is a common perception, I think, amongst those people who don't necessarily use weapons. Okay, so I'm not kind of, I'm not bad-mouthing anyone here, but there is a received wisdom that somehow an axe is a simpler weapon for simpler times, no mobile phone in sight, that is much easier to use than a sword, and that a sword somehow requires expertise to be effective with, whereas an axe doesn't require expertise and anybody could use an axe effectively. And I have taken umbrage with this point in the past, based on the fact that at the end of the day, fighting is fighting. It doesn't matter whether you're using a knife, a hammer, a big stick, a sword, or an axe. Fighting's fighting, okay? You work with the tool in hand, and combat's complicated. There ain't no easy way to, unfortunately in history, have a fight with someone who's trying to fight you back. Okay, so whether you're fighting with an axe or fighting with a sword, a lot of the same principles of distance and timing and being able to have some form of coherent defense and hitting the other person, having an effect, having the desired effect on them, they're basically the same principle things. They're the same ingredients for the cake you're trying to bake that you're going to be using, whether you're using a sword or using an axe. And my argument has always been, look, it doesn't matter whether you're, let's say, a character in a role-playing game, or whether you're reenacting. It doesn't really matter whether you're holding an axe or holding a sword. You're basically dealing with the same kind of problems and issues. You're fighting someone who's fighting you, and you're both trying to hurt each other or trying to protect yourself. However, that being said, I have to concede that certain things about the axe do in some ways make it easier to use than the sword. However, in the past, I've mostly argued that actually for most people, a sword is easier to use because you pick a sword up and it's balanced closer to your hand. You can move it around. You've got two edges. You've got a point as well as two edges. You've got a hand guard. But overall, so it's got loads of advantages as a weapon over an axe, but overall, the principal thing about the sword is the way that it's balanced, and this is a relatively heavy for its size arming sword, make it easier to use. Also, you've got a longer edge. So if I pick up a Langmesser, for example, this is an even lighter sword. So this is, pretty much anybody who's, able-bodied can pick this up, swing it around and be dangerous with it, just like they could with a kitchen knife. Because you've got a long old edge and a point on the end, and it's balanced in a way that makes it easier to move around than an axe. An axe requires more strength, I would argue, to be effective with. Or does it? Well, here's the thing, here's the funny thing. So, overall, for an expert fighter, the sword offers all sorts of advantages because it's quicker and nimbler. You've got more offensive and defensive options with it than you have with an axe. However, I think this is why we come to the fact that a lot of people perceive an axe to be an easier weapon to be effective with. And it's a little bit like a hammer. Okay, so pretty much everyone, even if it's as a child with a toy one, at some point in their lives uses a hammer. And let's face it, it's not complicated. You don't need to read a treatise, you don't need to attend lessons to know how to use a hammer. You pick it up, you see the nail or whatever you're hitting and you hit it. Most people can pick up an axe and chop down a tree. Obviously a trained professional is going to do it much more efficiently and quicker without getting winded quite so quickly. But basically anybody can hit a tree with an axe. It is pretty simple things. Now I would argue it's also pretty easy to just pick up a sword and hit with it. Yes, absolutely. However, when it comes to being offensive, there is an elephant in the room with swords, and I think this is something which people don't necessarily, who don't cut with swords, for example, who don't do test cutting and things like this, or don't do martial arts with swords, maybe don't appreciate. And that is that swords inherently don't usually have mass inertia, or in some cases gravity, if they're going downwards, on their side. What do I mean by that? Well, If we pick up this spadroon, for example, in order to be offensive, to cut through a target, okay, and that might be clothing on a person's body, or it might be a tatami mat or whatever, I have to get good edge alignment and I have to get a good amount of speed into the blade. Okay, now I'm cutting with a moulinet from a wrist here, but a person who wasn't trained might just simply bring the thing up and bring it crashing down. Now this blade is actually pretty light. If you want to imagine how unoffensive swords are when they're blunt, I'll look at fencing. So literally twice a week, in my case, and in many people's cases, once or potentially more than twice a week, we hit each other with swords for fun. Now, yeah, we put protective gear on, but when they're blunt, they don't usually hurt us. They sometimes leave a bruise. In a worst case scenario, they occasionally break someone's finger. But overall, we can receive hundreds and thousands of blows from blunt swords because they don't cut us. However, if we use blunt axes and hit each other, I can assure you we would be taking a pretty quick trip to the hospital every time we trained. The problem is, and this is the problem why we don't do a lot of axe or even poleaxe in some cases, certainly outside of armour, training in HEMA, is because if you make this blunt, it's still essentially a hammer, it's still a mace. It doesn't matter if you take the point off, it doesn't matter if you blunt that edge. It's still hugely offensive. Why is that? Quite simply because it balances at the end. The point of balance, unlike a sword, which balances pretty close to your hand, an axe or a mace or a hammer, or war hammer, balances near the head. That means that once you've got the thing into motion, it's going to hit. It's going to hit with a considerable amount of force. And even if the edge alignment's bad with this and it doesn't cut very well, it's still like being hit with a hammer or a mace, because it is like a hammer or a mace in terms of balance and inertia. In addition to that, we've got the often overlooked factor of gravity. Now, most people who strike with these sorts of objects instinctively strike downwards, and that is because you've got gravity on your side, but also your body, your physiology is advantageous to striking downwards. We have evolved in a way that means we can apply a lot of force striking downwards, but moreover, once you've gained that potential energy, the second you start turning it into kinetic energy added to the acceleration of gravity, that has a lot of force behind it. So, for that reason, axes, hammers, war hammers, maces, I would say for a lot of people, are easier to put a lot of energy into a target. That might be a tree, it might be a rock, or it might be an enemy if we're talking about historical periods when these were used. So, I would agree on some level that these top-heavy striking weapons like axes, hammers, maces are in some sense easier to cause harm with than a sword. Ish. However, we mentioned gravity, and this video, the main theme of this video is gravity. There is an exception. So one of the reasons that we strike downwards with these top-heavy weapons is because they're kind of tolerable at horizontal, but they are really bad at upwards, largely because they're slow. Because not only do you taking the thing down, but when you start rising it up, in order to get enough acceleration into the top-heavy head, you're having to fight against gravity. Now, a strong person can do that, and certainly a lighter axe or mace is easier to do that than a heavier one. But a sword, while it does have the gravity advantage of cutting downwards, you can cut upwards and accelerate it really quickly because the point of balance is near the hand and the blade is relatively light. There's not a huge amount of inertia at the tip of the blade compared to something like an axe or a hammer. So, quite simply, the sword is far more versatile at attacking at angles and directions that an axe or a mace really is rubbish at. Okay, and remember, this is a long edge, so as we're moving backwards and forwards and fighting each other, it's far easier for me to hit with any portion of this than an axe or a hammer, where I can only really have a great effect with a small portion of the end. So to conclude, is an axe, a hammer or a mace an easier weapon for a person to use? Overall, I would still argue no, not really. However, in one specific way, and I think this way converges with most people's exposure to hitting things. Most people can pick up a top-heavy object like an axe or a mace, raise their hand up, whack something, and it has a lot of effect. Whereas that might not always be the case with a sword. However, on balance, remember, as I said at the beginning, fighting is fighting, and fighting can be very complicated and very messy. So a trained person with an axe or a trained person with a sword, they could be the same person, they kind of balance out. Untrained people, is an untrained person with a sword less dangerous than an untrained person with an axe? I wouldn't really necessarily say so, no. Because while this, in some senses, when you're using gravity to strike downwards, you've got a greater percentage chance of doing damage with it than you have, at least an untrained person, with a sword. That being said, the sword has so many other advantages of having a long edge, a point, handguard, and being quicker and nimbler, quicker moving and less predictable than an axe, that overall I would say no. So, if you are making role-playing games, writing novels, perhaps even video games, anything like this, should a untrained person always be given a simpler weapon like this? No. In reality, in history, they were given weapons like this for economic reasons most of the time. Very occasionally because they were more effective against armour, but usually for economic reasons. If you could give your relatively untrained soldiers short swords and, you know, some kind of polearm or a missile weapon, then you did, and that's what happened historically. So do not think that untrained yokels from the farm who've received no training whatsoever should always have something simple like an axe. That was only really for economic and social reasons, not because a sword is somehow weirdly difficult to use. If you can swing this, you can swing that. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.